So congratulations on making it to the last video in the advanced features chapter of this course. You've covered a huge amount just in this section. We started off looking at timers and toolbars. Then we learned how to use table views before moving on to permanent data storage, multiple view controllers and controlling the keyboard. And then after building our to-do list app, we learned how to download and process data from the web. So our last app for this section is going to be the biggest app that we've made so far. So let's start by seeing how we're going to get the data for the app. We're going to be using a website called weather-forecast.com. And the particular thing I like about using this website is that you can get the weather for any location by putting that location right in the URL. So we're going to get the user to enter that location. Then all we need to do is get the contents of that URL. If you want to look at the contents of the URL, you can control click on your browser and click View Page Source. This will give you the HTML of the page, which don't worry, you don't need to understand at all. All you need to do is to be able to pick out the bit of the weather forecast that we're interested in, which is that bit there. So it's going to be the bit after weather forecast summary. So I'm going to use Command F to look for weather forecast summary. And there you can see that's the bit that we want to extract. So you'll need to do a combination of a few of the tricks that we learned in the previous video to extract that bit of information. Also, we're going to make a little bit of effort to make this app look pretty. And to do that, we're going to use a website called unsplash.com, which I'd thoroughly recommend for getting pretty easy to use photos that you can use for things like backdrops in your apps. So these are the ones that are on Unsplash at the time of recording this video. I think I'm going to go for that top cloudy one there. All right, so just before I set you the challenge of making the app, let's see what it's going to look like. You can see first off that we've put a little bit of thought into the design. You can see that nice background image makes a real difference to how the app looks. And the functionality is pretty simple. We just type the name of the city that we want to get weather for. So for example, Cambridge. Tap submit. And there you go. You can see we've got the weather for Cambridge right there. Really not that pleasant. So that's the bulk of what the app does. It's worth being aware though that you'll need to allow for error situations, of which there are mostly two types. So it's possible that the user will enter a city that doesn't exist. And if that happens, you'll need to elegantly show the user some kind of message rather than just let the app crash. And the other tricky situation is when you have cities with spaces in, such as San Francisco. You need to be able to deal with those as well, and you'll need to find a way to create a valid URL when the entry has a space in it. So I'll leave that as a challenge for you. As always, do as much of this as you can yourself, but feel free to watch the video afterwards to see how I did it. Good luck. All right, I hope that went well. We're going to start, of course, in the usual way by creating a new project. So as usual, we'll go for the single view application. And I'll avoid punctuation, question marks, etc. We'll call it What's the Weather? And save it there on the desktop. And we'll start by putting together our UI. So I'm going to jump back over to unsplash.com and I'm going to control click and I'm going to just click on that link there to get the photo and then click download. And there it is. And again, put it on the desktop. I'll call it background. And one thing I'd recommend doing before you insert it into your app is just load up the image. So if you've downloaded in Chrome, it should be there. If you tap on that, you can open it up in preview, and then Tools, Adjust Size, because usually on Unsplash they're very, very large and we don't need anywhere near like that number of pixels. It's just going to slow our app down and increase the size and weight of the app, which we don't want. So I'm going to go for about 1,000 pixels. That should be plenty. There we go. And I'm just going to save that and then shut it down. Okay, so back over to Xcode, and then I'll just jump over to Finder to get the image and drag that into our app. Default options, copy the item into our app. And there we go. All right, so now let's get an image view for our image. And I'm going to make this a full screen image, so right up to the top of the screen. And I'll add in constraints to stretch it right to the edge of the screen. And then now we've got our background. That doesn't look great. So let's see what options work quite well. So we could go for the aspect fit. In most cases, as I said, that's what we want, but for a background, that's not quite right. So let's try center. Now that looks actually pretty good. We can mess around and have a look at the other options just to see which part of the image works well. I think probably that center option. Quick look there. Yeah, let's go for center. All right. Notice that although this will look fine on the iPhone 6s, the orientation changes. That actually still looks pretty good. On the smaller phones, it still looks good. On the 6s Plus, though, we don't quite have enough resolution to get us to the full screen there. So when you're converting your images for your apps, make sure that you know what devices you're going to be supporting and that your resolution is high enough and that your positioning is right for all of those different devices. Okay, so let's start adding our UI elements. We'll begin with a label. So up the top there, we'll have what's the weather. And let's go for making that pretty big. Try 30. Good. Center it a little and then excellent. So we'll add the top constraint. Make sure I'm selecting it. And then top constraint and center horizontally. And because it doesn't stretch to the edge, we'll need to set a width. We might as well set a height as well. Then we'll add another label to instruct the user to enter your city. And again, we'll give that a top constraint and center horizontally. Then we'll bring in our text field for the user to be able to enter their city. There we go. And I'll put a bit of placeholder text, e.g. London, comma, San Francisco. There we go, looks nice. And then we'll set left, right, and top constraints, and that'll stretch it out to the very edges of the screen, regardless of screen size. Next, we'll need a button. And we'll just call that submit. And finally, we'll have a label, which I'll stretch again to the edge of the screen. This is going to be where we put the results of the weather. So we'll center it and change it to 0 lines so that we can have as many lines as we like. Okay, so there's our user interface. Looks a little darker and brooding than perhaps is necessary, but I think it's quite pleasant. So let's now create all our outlets and actions to start making our app do something. So we'll need an outlet for the text field. So this is city text field. We'll need another outlet for the result label. I'll call that result label. And finally, we'll need an action for the submit button. I'll call that get weather. All right, so now we're all set up UI-wise. Let's have a quick look, make sure it works. Ah yes, I may have forgotten to add constraints for the button and the label. That's why it's always good to check. So they both just need a top constraint and centering in the container, and same for label. That will likely need a width and a height as well, because the text is not stretched all the way to the edge. And then let's center it horizontally. Wonderful. Have another look. Much better. There we go. You can see a slight issue with the submit button not showing very clearly. That shows you how important it is to choose your background images carefully. I'm going to carry on, but you might want to be a bit fussier with your background image and choose one with a little less contrast. All right. So let's now jump over to viewcontroller.swift, and I'm going to start by just getting the contents of that website and printing them to the console so that I know that everything's set up correctly. So we'll begin with a URL, and I'm just going to choose the London forecast. So that gives me a URL of and I'll just add in string there to show that we're creating the URL from a string. Then we create the request, which is an NS mutable URL request using a URL of URL. That is the URL we defined just here. Then we'll create our task, which is a URL session shared, and then data task with a request. And we need to cast that to a URL request. Okay, we've got an error there because we need to unwrap the URL. I'm going to force unwrap that because I created the string myself, so I know that that's going to work. And then here, as before, we're expecting data, response, and error in, and this is where we're going to put our code for the task. And before I forget, I'm going to write task resume to get the task going. Okay, so as before, we'll check if there's an error, and if there is, for now we'll just print it, and if there isn't, we'll check to see if we can create a variable called unwrapped data, which is equal to data. And that means we've got some data. So we can create a data string from it, which is going to be an NS string created from some data. And the data that we're going to use is unwrapped data. And the encoding, as before, is string dot encoding, not fastest encoding, string dot encoding dot UTF-8 and then raw value. And for now, we'll just print data string. All right, so almost ready to go, but notice that this is not HTTPS, it's HTTP. So we're going to need to whitelist our URL in the info.plist file. And I'm actually going to show you a different way of doing it this time, just so that you're aware of both ways. So if we control click on info.plist and open as source code, then we can see the actual source code behind the file. And this allows us to edit the file more directly rather than just the kind of drag and drop method that we had before. So this file is an XML file, and it's a bit like an HTML file, but it's designed for containing data. So you can see we've got things like keys and strings, which are the values associated with each key. So to add our domain exception, we just go down to the bottom of this list. So before we close the dictionary, which contains all of our settings, and then we're going to add a new key, and that key is going to be NS app transport security. Make sure you spell it right or it won't work. And then we're going to add a dictionary. I'll just end the dictionary so I don't forget to do so later. And then within the dictionary, we have another key, which is NS exception domains in the key. And within that key, we're going to have another dictionary, which is going to have a key of the domain that we want, which is weather-forecast.com. There we go. And then to allow HTTP requests, we add our final key, which is NS temporary exception allows insecure HTTP loads. End the key and then true. And this is a self-ending key, so we need a slash before the closing square brackets there. All right, so if we now run that, we should find that we get the results or the content of the domain that we need, or the page that we need, which is weatherforecast.com/location/London/forecasts/latest. And then we just need one more key, which is to specify NS includes subdomains. So a subdomain is something that goes before weatherforecast.com. So for example, www. would be a subdomain, and you might also have something like secure.weatherforecast.com. So you don't have to include subdomains, but generally I would recommend it to make sure that all the URLs that you need to access will be available. Okay, so here we go. We should now find that when we run the app, the contents of that URL are returned for us. And here we go. So if you scroll up, we can see we've got the text that we need. Let's just make that nice and large. Fabulous. So there's the HTML of the page that we're interested in. Now let's see how we're going to extract the information that we want. So I'm going to jump back over to Chrome and again, control click and view page source. And remember, the text that we want is this chunk of text there. And that looks like it comes after where it says London 1 to 3 day weather forecast summary. So let's look for weather forecast summary. So we can see it appears 3 times on the page. But the first time is the time that we're interested in. And the text or the code that immediately precedes it is this span class equals phrase, and then span class equals read more small, and then the text that we're interested in. So I'm just going to select that. My guess is that whole lot of code only appears once in the page. Oh no, it actually appears more than once, but we only want the first time. So that's what counts. So let's create a variable. I'll call it string separator. And I might as well spell separator correctly. And that's going to be that, but be careful because we've got double quotes inside the string. So you may or may not have seen this before. We use backslashes to escape these double quotes. And that's true in pretty much any programming language. And that's just a way of saying that these quotes are part of the string. I'm not saying that we should end the string. So once we've escaped all of the double quotes inside the string, so let's take our data string and we're going to set up components which are going to be separated by string separator. And I'll put an if let in there, and I'll call that content array to equal that. And if it works, we'll print it to the console. All right then, let's have a look. So this should give us the same content as before, but it'll be separated out into different parts of an array by this text here. So what we're particularly interested in is the first result will have everything before this, so all of that, which we don't care about, but the second result, or the first item in the array, will or should start with the text that we're interested in. So let's have a look, see if that's worked. Okay, so yep, it definitely looks like we've got an array there. If I search for the text that I want, which is moderate rain, yep, you can see that that starts the second item in the array. Fabulous. Okay, so now we're almost there. All we need to do is get rid of everything after the end of that chunk of text. So that starts where it says close the span. So that's going to be our new string separator. So let's bring that back down. And there's a chance, of course, that this string won't be found at all. And if that's the case, then content array will only have a single item in it, and that will be the whole HTML. So that might happen, for example, if the page changes their code, or if we get a bad URL for some reason. So we should allow for those possibilities. And I'll do that by saying if content array dot count is greater than 0, then we know that we can use content array 1. So we're now going to want to change string separator. So rather than create a new variable, I'll just make that a var, and we'll update string separator to be close the span. And once again, I'll do an if let, and this will be a new content array. And this time we're going to take content array 1, and we're going to split that into its components, separated by string separator. So remember, content array 1 is where the description that we're interested in, i.e. this bit, starts. So we're going to take that and split it by the close span. And then the first item returned should be just the bit of text that we're interested in. Okay. So once again, we'll check to see if new content array dot count is greater than 0. And if it is, the thing that we actually want should be in new content array 0, i.e. the first element in the array when this is split by the closing span there. All right, so fingers crossed. While that's compiling, I'm going to set up a variable to store this. And this is going to be the message that the user sees. So at the beginning, I'll set the message to an empty string. And then here, if we're right, I'll update the message to be new content array 0. Oh, now we have a problem with our code here. Okay, this is not an optional, so I guess this will return a value no matter what. So let's just get rid of the if statement there, which is that one. There we go. And we'll just have a let there. And we'll delete the breakpoint. You don't want anything strange happening around that line. And there we go. You can see that the only thing that's been printed is the bit that we're interested in. Fantastic. One small issue we do have is that you can see instead of the degrees symbol, we're seeing an and, deg, and a colon, and then a C. And this is because this is what's known as an HTML entity. It's a way of describing a character such as a degree symbol. But we don't want that appearing on our app, so we're going to need to replace that with the degree symbol. How do we do that? Well, you might be able to guess that if we take our new content array 0 and then maybe have a look at the options that are available to us, there might be one involving replace. And here we go. So we can replace characters. That's not quite what we want to do. We want to replace occurrences of strings with strings. Perfect. So the string that we want to replace is and deg colon. There we go. And then we want to replace that with the degree symbol itself, which you get on a Mac by typing Option Shift 8. There we go. So pop that into double quotes, and we should now be able to see the message in the format that we want. Okay, while that's compiling, let's think about how we're going to display this message for the user. And there we go. So it all looks good. So at the very end of the task, I believe that's down there, we're going to want to display something to the user whether it was successful or not. So just, there we go. Yep, I think that's the end of the task there. So we can do a check to see if the message is equal to an empty string. And if it is, then something's gone wrong because we didn't get to that line there. So if that's the case, we'll set the message to something like the weather there couldn't be found. Please try again. And then we'll display the message. And you'll remember that to do that, we use dispatch queue.main.sync. And then, actually, let's get the nice prediction for us. There we go. Sync, and then we want to put our code in there, and this will dispatch the queue and display our text as soon as it's ready. So if you remember, we called the result label, very sensible of us. So let's set result label.text to be equal to the message. All right, so let's give it a go. Ah, yes, we haven't come across this issue before. Inside task here, we've got our chunk of code, which is known as a closure, as it's doing something off the main thread. And then when you want to refer to something outside of that closure, i.e. something in the view controller here, from within the closure, you need to use self to reference the view controller. And then we use self dot and then result label.text. And then we can set that equal to the message. So it's just a subtle addition that we need to clarify that result label is not inside this closure. It's actually defined out here in the view controller itself. All right. Of course, we're a little way from our app actually working usefully at the moment because we've hard-coded the URL into the app. So we're going to get the London weather no matter what we type into the box. But that's okay. It's worth just checking that we get some response at all when we run the app. And there you go. You can see we've got the weather, which is great. It doesn't quite all fit in the box. So I think what I'll do there is make the box text a little bit smaller. Easy enough. So let's take that down to 12 and we'll see how that looks. And while we're here, we can get rid of the initial text so we don't see anything until there is some content there. All right, so now all that remains is to actually get the user's URL, which we're going to get by replacing London with the city that the user entered, which is city text field dot text. Okay, and also we're going to move all of this code out of view did load, and we're going to run it in the get weather method, which is when the button is pressed. So let's test that out. We should now be able to enter a city name and get the weather for that city. And here we go. So let's type in, for example, Paris. And check it out. And there you go. So you can see the weather from Paris there. So that means we have a more or less functioning app. However, you might be able to anticipate a few problems with the app in its current form. Essentially, our major issue is that if the user enters a city name that causes this to be an invalid URL, so it has a space or strange character in it, then this attempt to make a URL out of this string will fail, and because we've said, no, don't worry, this will definitely succeed, by trying to force unwrap it, we'll get a crash. So to deal with that, we need to do two things. First off, we need to change this to an if let statement, as I mentioned at the beginning. So we'll only run all of this code if we can get a valid URL. And if we can't, then we'll give an error message. So we'll set result label.text to be equal to, we'll just use the standard message we've got there. Notice we don't need self this time because we're not inside the closure or the task. We're outside of that now. Okay, so that's hopefully saved us from invalid URLs. But there are some city names with things like spaces in, which we still need to be able to work with. So if we try San Francisco, for example, you can see that the URL here encodes that as a hyphen. So what we'll do is we'll take our city text field text and replace occurrences of space with a hyphen. And that should allow us to enter names of cities that have spaces in, and they'll be converted to having hyphens instead. And therefore, not only will they be valid URLs, but they'll be the correct URL for weatherforecast.com. Okay, so let's check it out. We should now find that we can enter even cities with spaces in and get their weather as well. And just before we run that, I have noticed one issue with my code here, and that is that the count should be checking for greater than 1, not greater than 0, because the count will always be greater than 0, because we'll always have at least one item in the array. So what we're really looking for is having more than 1 for the count, or 2 or more. So let's try this out. We should be able to avoid any crashes on error messages, and we should also be able to enter things with spaces in, like San Francisco. Let's take a look. And here we go. So first off, let's just see what happens if we don't enter anything at all. We should find that we get a nice error message back. And there we go. The weather there couldn't be found. Please try again. Fantastic. You might want to add a few more and give a more specific error message of please enter a city in the text field or something like that. But I'll leave that up to you. And here we go. So let's enter San Francisco. I'll just go back and get rid of the full stop there. And here we go. And there we go. Super. As usual, much better weather than there is here right now. Fantastic. So that's as far as we're going to go. As I say, you might want to do some slightly more advanced error checking so you can give the user a bit more information about what went wrong if we couldn't get some weather for their area. You might also want to look into changing the formatting a little if the weather is successful, so making this green perhaps, or making it red if it's an error message. Lots you could try, but I'd recommend leaving it there, taking a little break, and then getting ready for the next section, Advanced iOS Features 2, in which we're going to be looking at a whole range of even more powerful iOS features like maps, animations, music, and motion features like swiping and shaking. There's a lot to do, so I look forward to seeing you at the beginning of the next section.